Hello, Satanico here for Godlovescomics, and today I've got another small unboxing video. Right here is the box. You can see how small it is, how thin it is. There are only 2 comics inside that box, so it is indeed a very, very small unboxing video, especially when compared to all the other YouTube videos where people will actually go through a long box or 2 long boxes and 20 or 30 minutes, or sometimes 15 minutes, where they're barely showing a cover for 2 seconds before they're on to the next. But here we do things, or specifically I do things, a little bit differently and a little bit more in depth. So I'm going to discuss the comic inside, but first I'm going to say, as you can see the backdrop, that's maybe a little bit of a hint, but this is a comic book that the specific comic book itself is not some sort of grail comic book, but the publisher is one that is incredibly famous and kind of legendary in a sense, and that I've always sort of wanted some of these original comics and never really had the money or the inclination or the wherewithal to purchase. And for whatever reason, I've never actually won an auction. I've never done an auction on my comic shop. I use it for reference, but I've never purchased anything from there. But I saw that the auctions had this specific comic, and literally it was 3 minutes away from the auction completing. And it was around, I think it was around $55 or something. So on an impulse, on a whim, I signed up within 3 minutes and placed the bid. Now, my comic shop does something different than eBay, and it's a little bit more insidious, because eBay, if you put your bid in the last 30 seconds, which is basically what I did with 30 seconds left, on eBay, 30 seconds later, you own the comic or somebody beat you out. On my comic shop, if you put a bid in after, with only 3 minutes left, then your bid, that it renews everything for another 3 minutes. So it essentially gives somebody another 3 minutes to up your bid, which is a pretty, smart way of them making sure that the bid goes higher and higher. And so I placed this bid, and it was the highest bid, but then of course it extended the auction for another 3 minutes, and someone else bid, but they bid under what I did. I think when I came on it was maybe $55, so I put a bid in for $61.50, and I guess the next person came in and they just did the minimum next bid, like $57 maybe, and for whatever reason I was surprised. They did it with maybe 90 seconds left. That extended another 3 minutes, but somehow I won the auction. So let's go ahead and cut into this little box. Got plenty to say about this comic, and actually there are 2 comics. I won the auction, and then I went ahead and purchased one other very small but very interesting comic that was on there that some people have heard of and some people are not even aware exist. So, okay, it's got, it just comes in this little box, and then we've got this backing board, and then it's right here. So, the main comic in here is not in very good condition, but for the grade, it actually looked pretty good for the grade. But it's a very, very low grade comic, which is why I could afford it. But I have a lot to recommend, and you can hear that tape go. So, seems like they've put these both in the same bag. And there you go. Let's pop these out. Alrighty. So here is, and it looks actually really good in the bag. despite, you can certainly see the wear, but it's actually, in the bag it looks quite nice. There you go right there. Weird Fantasy number 19. Let's see. A nice, good look. And that is a cover, as you can see. The signature right there is by Joe Orlando. And that is actually the only EC comic I have in my collection. I don't have an extensive collection. I rarely pay very much for comics. I certainly haven't been lucky enough to go to a garage sale and stumble across old comics that were of any value. So, like I said, this was an impulse buy. I read the description. It had a lot of great artists that I liked. And this is rated as a 2.0. And I saw, as I said, I think I paid about $58. I think that was the $57, $58 was the actual. I bid $61.50, and I think it came out where ultimately the winning bid was like $58. Should say it right here. Yes, exactly $58. Okay, so, and I think I looked this comic up, and usually around this condition, around 1.5, 2.0, and they were running pretty consistently, even on eBay, where things often are dirt cheap, for around $80. So I didn't get a fantastic, unbelievable deal. I didn't steal, but it was a perfectly good deal, a perfectly reasonable deal, and I'm pretty happy with it. Looking at it right here, you can see, I'll take it out of the bag, of course, because we're going to look through this pretty extensively, but you can see there's a lot of stress. There was a spine split. It's pretty much loose. There's no staple in place there. There's a significant, I think they said about 2.5 inch, and that looks about right, spine split at the bottom staple, and then the top final staple is really tenuous, and a little bit of discoloration, a little bit of creasing in the corner. The bottom corner looks really nice, and the actual central image, and of course the classic sort of EC titling, looks fantastic. Actually looks really beautiful. And this comic was released in 1950, and although you're going to have to sit here and stare at the comic while I do this, I'm actually going to discuss a little bit of context in terms of what 1950 was like at the time this comic came out, in terms of how much people were making, and what the world was like in general. There's the comic out of the bag. Actually still looks, obviously everything looks better in the bag. You can see there's a crease, a little bit of a creasing down here. But yeah, actually looks quite nice. And this comic had a lot to recommend. The Joe Orlando cover is beautiful. And inside it has a profile of Howell Williamson, probably my favorite of all time EC comics artist, one of my favorite comics artists of all time anyway. I've talked about him extensively in terms of his adaptations of Blade Runner and of The Empire Strikes Back, of Return of the Jedi, of Flash Gordon, and of course his work on EC, a lot of times with Roy Krenkel and Frank Frazetta, was legendary. So it's got a profile of him, and I believe it has a Williamson artwork inside. I think it may have a Wally Wood story. I'm not remembering exactly, but let's put that right there. Take a look at it for a second, and let's just discuss for just a moment the context of 1950, if I can pull this up. Okay, so in 1950, it was literally 5 years after World War II. The cost of a new house in the United States was $8,400, which I think everyone would like to be able to buy a pretty decent house for $8,400 these days. The average salary was $3,200. So if you think about that, $8,400 is about 3 times as much. So if you extrapolate to today's salaries, if somebody was making $30,000 a year, then essentially they'd be purchasing a $90,000 house. So pretty much inflation-wise, it pretty much adds up similarly, I suppose. Gas was 18 cents a gallon. I remember when it was maybe around $1. So, and a new car cost $1,500. Meanwhile, a Stromberg black and white TV costs $250, which, think about that. That may not sound like very much, but you're saying, first of all, Stromberg. I'm not familiar with the company. I don't think I've ever heard of a Stromberg TV. I don't think they're still in business or making TVs, or if they are, they're certainly a marginalized company. But think about that, $250. That's a case where that was a luxury item especially when you were making $3,200 a year. That's a luxury item that takes a really big bite out of your yearly salary. And today, 6 decades later, give or take a few, you can buy, basically you can go to Target right now and buy a 40-inch flat panel smart TV for $250. So that's a case where technology facilitated cheaper technology, essentially. So now that's an interesting thing. And the same thing here. Clock radio was really a luxury item. A clock radio cost $60. Now, obviously, there are plenty of clock radios on the market, various things that cost more than that. But you can easily, once again, go to Walmart, Target, and get a $30 clock radio that works brilliantly. So those sort of technology items were actually quite expensive compared to now, where they're ubiquitous and they're incredibly cheap. Of course, we weren't importing everything from China, and so that certainly had an impact as well. Tom Petty and Stevie Wonder were both born in 1950 when this comic came out. Tom Petty, as most people probably are aware, passed away last month, or if it was even last month, it may have been this month. It was just a couple of weeks ago, actually. And so that's pretty ironic as well. Stevie Wonder is still fine, thank God. And there were TVs in only 8 million homes. So people were still really reading books. They were still reading comics. 8 million homes. If you think about it, we have a population of about 350 million now. I would say there are probably 700 million to a billion TVs in this country, considering that everyone has at least one or two. Everyone probably has 2. Even though TVs are fading out with the advent of, people watching Netflix and not even needing a TV anymore. Additionally, James Dean got his first big break in 1950 because he was cast in a Pepsi commercial, and Truman authorized the production of the hydrogen bomb after infamously ordering 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan. 67 years later, we have North Korea, which is threatening to test the hydrogen bomb. That shows you that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Joseph Stalin was still the leader of Russia in 1950. And get this one shocked me. Winston Churchill, however, in 1950 was defeated by the Labour Party's Clement Attlee. Now, that's not a name that goes down in history, Clement Attlee. Winston Churchill, just 5 years prior, saved Britain. Basically, the man credited with kind of raising the spirits of Britain and the stiff upper lip approach in the darkest days of the British Empire, when Great Britain was on the brink of annihilation from the Nazis' bombing campaign. And 5 years after rescuing, or, with a lot of noble bombers and the populace in general maintaining that stiff upper lip. But 5 years later, they voted him out of office. I mean, that's just absolutely extraordinary. 1950 also, South Africa effectively implemented apartheid, And coming full circle to this comic, 1950 was when Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy, rose to power and became sort of the paranoia agent of America, where it was really the initiation of the Cold War. You had this mentally deranged senator, which we have many, or at least a few mentally deranged senators even in 2017, and we have probably the most mentally deranged politician is actually the leader of our country. I would never call him anything but the resident, and it's best to just refer to him, as some people do, as 45. But in 1950, it was Joe McCarthy, paranoia agent, seeing commies everywhere. The era of heightened censorship would prove like the most historical event related to EC itself, because EC Comics, despite comics like weird fantasy, weird science fantasy, they were, as you can see by this Comics Journal cover, they were the foremost horror producer of comics. Probably the best quality horror comics in the world, at least in the English-speaking world. And as you can see, Tales from the Crypt, the Vault of Horror, and then there are some sort of the second wave, Aces High, shock, panic, crime, suspense stories. So the rise of Joe McCarthy sort of facilitated someone like Frederick Wortham, who created the book Seduction of the Innocents, which would snowball censorship and the belief that comics were a corrupting influence on the youth, and would essentially be the death knell for the best publisher of horror comics in the world at the time. And indeed, incredibly gory comics, but also with a sense of humor. And all of that is fairly well-worn territory for people that are familiar with comics history, and you could certainly, if you wanted to know more about it, you could go and read a book called 10 Cent Plague, which covers that in great depth. But, so that's sort of the background, that's sort of the setting that we have for this comic. So let's go ahead and take a look inside. And, that's the sort of upsetting part, and maybe a little bit difficult. So you can see that the interior is almost about to fall apart. This is the one staple that's maybe holding it together. Barely. So almost a detached cover, pretty much a detached cover. But there you go right there. A profile of Howell Williamson as a young man, handsome guy, born in Colombia. Or actually, they say he was born in New York City. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. He was born in New York City. His family moved to Colombia, South America, and when Howell was 2 years old. And I always associate that, I think I've talked about it before, but Howell Williamson drew some of the most beautiful flora and fauna, these incredible sort of rainforests on alien planets, backgrounds, and all of these exotic lizards and chameleons and things in his panels. And I think a lot of that had to do with probably the time that he spent in Colombia. Of course, perhaps he was in the big city and never even saw the rainforest, but certainly seems quite likely. Howell started to draw comics as a hobby in 1940 while in South America, worshiping first Carlos Kliman, a noted South American illustrator, and then Alex Raymond, who was, of course, famous for drawing Flash Gordon, and I think Buck Rogers as well. Incidentally, Al's last job before coming to EC was drawing Buster Crabbe comics. Buster Crabbe was actually the star of Flash Gordon, I do believe. And also, was Buster Crabbe, I think, an Olympian swimmer? I'm not sure. But after completing schooling, he attended the Cartoonist and Illustrator School in New York City for 3 years. That's where Al met Wally Wood, Another legendary EC illustrator, of course. In 1948, he became Bern Hogarth's assistant, working on Tarzan's syndicated comic strips for a short while. Then he began freelancing until he joined EC about a year ago. So this is really interesting. This is Howell Williamson. Has only been with EC for a year. They're profiling him on the inside cover. Today, Howell lives in Brooklyn and is still enjoying the freedom of bachelorhood. He dresses casually, sleeps in the raw. Interesting, very interesting detail there. His hobbies include photographing live models in the raw. Well, that's one that I didn't know. He's not really known for his sort of erotic or nudes. And sketching live models in the raw and collecting live models, double exclamation point. So somebody's being pretty funny here. I wonder if this is William M. Games from, the publisher who eventually created Mad Magazine wrote this, or if it was Al Feldstein. They all had a pretty good sense of humor there. He also collects old comic books and strips and classical and jive records. Al feels he's been doing his best work for us here at EC, and he appreciates the encouragement you fans have given him in letters and cards. His art appears regularly in Weird Science and Weird Science Fantasy, and occasionally in the horror and suspense stories mags. So yeah, he's not a guy who is really associated with horror at all compared to some of the other EC artists. Obviously the most famous being Ghastly Ingalls, Jack Kamen, Jack Davis, of course. Even Johnny Craig, who had a really clean style, but boy, did he draw some pretty scary stuff. So, see down here, Weird Fantasy, May, June. Okay. I thought it was in 1950 because I believe, maybe that's when EC started. I believe that they listed it as a 1950 book in the auction, but it's actually 1953, but close enough. So it's 8 years after the termination of World War II, which is close enough proximity in terms of time that you could probably still smell some of the sulfur from the gunpowder 8 years later. And here on this first page, if you can see, this is called King of the Gray Spaces, and I see the signature is Severin and Elder, so I'm fairly certain that's John Severin, a very young John Severin, just as it's a very young Al Williamson. Both have passed away now. And Will Elder, who was also a guy who was long associated with Mad Magazine after EC's comics line sort of demised. This is a little bit of a tricky proposition, though, because the way I have the camera set up, I can only show this if I hold it up, but holding it up, the cover is very close to detaching, so it's not something I was aware of, but see a little bit of the artwork there. Kind of a very clean, straightforward style. John Severin, extremely talented artist. This is in his very formative stages. He later became obviously very well known for his war comics and did stuff for, pretty sure he worked with Robert Kanigher, sort of famously curmudgeonly writer at DC, and also obviously worked with Marvel and Stan Lee, Dick Ayers, people like that. So this is called Hot Rod, and I may have to look up the listing for this comic book just to be certain who the artists are. Yeah. Oh boy. I have to give up on this cover, I'm afraid. Just going to have to chalk it up to a detached cover, because I don't think it's going to hold up much longer. Spine split is considerable, as you can see. Yeah, you can see very clearly now. just barely held in place. The front cover is just barely held in place by the staple right here, and then the rest of it is just detached from the spine. But so that's a little bit unfortunate, but doesn't really, not too detrimental to the book itself. And see some of the nice artwork. And coming up is an Howell Williamson story, which is pretty worthwhile, but this is the kind of stuff that you want to get the original comics for. It's just the ephemera inside. Even though I'm not sure, I've never seen the Russ Cochran. I mean, I've seen them, and I think they're in black and white, but they may have some color versions. I'm not terribly well versed in that, but Russ Cochran did the entire EC. He reprinted the entire EC library, probably multiple times now, multiple printings probably, but I don't know if they include all of the ephemera, the letters pages and everything. I would assume they would, because those things are of great interest, but it's not certain. You can see there, this is the cover for Weird Science 19. This is Weird Fantasy 19. These books were very close to ending, as I said, the sort of war being waged on comics and as being children's literature, and thus being a corrupting influence when there was no sort of comics code in place. Forced EC to constrict their publishing, and Weird Science and Weird Fantasy became Weird Science Fantasy. Ran on for a few more issues before I think that was canceled as well. I think it eventually became Incredible Fantasy, something like Incredible Science Fantasy. Not sure. And then there was sort of the second wave of comics, which were a little bit more toned down, like Piracy and Valor, I should say. Beautiful cover right there. Looks like Wally Wood, but I'm not absolutely positive. You see some of the other advertisement stories from the Bible, ironically. This is when they were still, this is educational comics. Now, EC Comics started as educational comics, and they were, in fact, doing stories like this. Picture stories of science, picture stories of world history, stories from the Bible. So this is truly educational comics. And then they sort of became known more as entertainment comics, the EC. But as you can see, they were still doing this branch of their business as well. And this looks like a humor piece. It's not attributed to anyone, this text piece, but looks a little bit silly. And here's the letters page, which might be pretty interesting. And we're going to talk a little bit about these artists as well. And as you can see, this one, beautiful. Brainchild, drawn by Howell Williamson. Howell Williamson was frequently aided on his stories and kind of worked hand in hand, almost like a studio sort of setup, where, you know, if he was behind a little bit, Frank Frazetta, who was a friend of his, would come in and do some of the inking, Roy Krenkel, and the same thing. Frazetta might have a penciling job, and Howell Williamson might do some of the inking. So it's quite often that those guys were intermingled in terms of their artwork, and some of the most famous and most talented artists ever to work in comics were basically this little band of 20-something cartoonists who were all working together at the time, just by happenstance in a way. So let's take a look at Cosmic Correspondence. Hopefully, if anyone's still listening. Weird Fantasy number 17 had the best cover I've ever seen on an ST mag. I'm not sure what that is. Science Fantasy. Oh, okay. SF mag. Yes. Joe Orlando was at his greatest when he did In the Beginning. You should have him do a cover. Jim Farley, Guelph, Ontario, Canada. Well, Joe Orlando did this cover, so they certainly were listening. I'm a faithful fan of yours and read every EC mag I can get my hands on, especially weird science and weird fantasy. But lately, what has happened to those horrible monsters which you were brought into every story so cleverly at the end? Just a few more monsters in your story will keep you on top, in my opinion. Josh, a fan, no address given. I thought the aliens in Weird Fantasy number 17 was excellent throughout. My hat is off to you for a completely unusual theme. Robert Nussbaum, Hollywood, California. See if there are any familiar names here, like anyone famous. Even though these, you don't have to be famous to write something interesting. Let's see. Well, these are all very short, sort of edited letters here, like Soft Rains
by Ray Bradbury was really tops, says Gerald Justice from Hopeville, Georgia. Another letter, enjoyed Soft Rains best of all, Dick Hutchinson from Brooklyn, New York. I was very happy to see Mr. Bradbury's Soft Rains. I think I heard it on the radio several years ago, but your version was much better. Many thanks, Cliff Hemphill. So that's also sort of an interesting, I don't know if juxtaposition is the word I'm looking for, but in the sense that you had Ray Bradbury, who was a fiction writer, of course, science fiction writer, even though some of these listed him as America's foremost horror fiction writer, which is pretty interesting because he's better associated with things like the Martian Chronicles these days, but he also wrote plenty of sort of horror short fiction. You know, Something Wicked This Way Comes may qualify as horror, maybe, but you know, this was at a time when, as I said, there were 8 million TVs in the United States, so people were still listening to radio, and people were still listening to fiction, essentially an audiobook, fiction being read over the radio. And this is an instance where we had a radio translation and a comics translation. Of course, this guy said that the comics version was much better because it was illustrated, of course, by some of the finest cartoonists ever to work in the business. So that's the letters page. As you can see from the above sampling, Mr. Bradbury's continuing to create quite a stir among you fans. Both pro and con letters are pouring in, for the most part, either violently pro or violently con. Until we have a better picture at the general consensus of opinion, we'd still like to postpone discussion of EC's future policy regard to Bradbury and other top-notch SF authors. Well, that's really strange. So they were commissioning these stories, essentially, and I think they were... I don't think Bradbury was actually writing the scripts for him. I think they were just being translated from Bradbury's short stories into comic stories. Maybe by Al Feldstein, but I'm not positive on that. And so it looks like everything was very, very pro. But, oh, okay, here's one of the violently con, I suppose. Cut out the Bradbury stuff. It is insufferably stupid. If Bradbury is tops seems to be a big complimentary word at that time, give me the bottom. The Bradbury stories have definitely lowered the EC standards. M.R. Putnam, Columbus, Ohio. Okay, well that is really interesting. Okay, and this is, I have bought no other comics but ECs for 2 years now, and I've always believed your products were the best possible. Your stories have been wonderful, the art marvelous, and your latest edition of Bradbury stories has certainly added even more for the money. Frankly, I can't see how you can produce such a perfect mag and charge only the price that those trashy, run-of-the-mill, crude imitations cost. Weird Fantasy number 17 is the finest EC ever put on the stands. Your adaptation of Bradbury's Soft Rains was fantastic. George Eskin, Cumberland, Maryland. So you have the good, mostly the violently pro, but you have one violently, I guess, opposed, who said it was insufferable, and then you have the EC editors saying the book, the jury is out on whether they're going to continue some Bradbury adaptations. And of course they have the address for letters, which you can try, but I would guess it's probably out of commission these days. The editor is Weird Fantasy, room 706, department 19, 225 Lafayette Street, New York City, 12 NY. Well, that's interesting. It does not have a zip code. It just says 12 NY. I'm not sure if zip codes were active then. I'm not sure. It's interesting. So, I'm going to hold this in a relatively precarious way. So this is absolutely beautifully illustrated by Howell Williamson. And some art I haven't seen before, which is always the hope, because it's so easy. It would be easy to find the story somewhere online, or at least some images. You might not find the whole thing. So, but this character, this illustration looks a lot like his sort of illustrations for, I believe, Buck Rogers, which Frank Frazetta worked on quite a bit, and this looks a lot like a Frank Frazetta Howell Williamson collaboration, or it looks like Frazetta may have done some of the inking, or maybe even some of the penciling. Maybe wrong about that. EC scholars may know better, but one of the most famous covers, not just in EC Comics history, but in all of comics history, I believe, is it Weird Fantasy 29? It has a Frank Frazetta cover, the classic, where he's like, where like a guy's beating off Neanderthal. Well, I shouldn't put it that way. He's clubbing Neanderthals with like a thigh bone, and it's incredibly visceral. And in a comic, actually, I do want to purchase, but it's pretty expensive. There is one for auction that's in pretty bad shape, so who knows? But and that cover was actually intended to be a Buck Rogers cover, but it was altered slightly, and I think added to Weird Fantasy. So Frazetta has a history with that character, just as Williamson has with Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon as well. And even though they're working in the sort of classic EC format of these sort of 7-panel pages, 4, two side by side, and then 3 small ones at the bottom, and quite a lot of text. Still able to use a small amount of room to illustrate this so beautifully. This last page is a little bit more utilitarian than typical, but and perhaps one day I'll actually read one of these, but for the video. And this is also beautifully drawn, and this is by Joe Orlando. Joe Orlando, we're going to talk a little bit about these writers and artists, I should say, as well. Beautifully drawn by Joe Orlando. See if I can sit this here without the cover falling off. Okay. So, let me pull up, let's see if I can hold this. And by the way, I still have one other comic here that's a little bit more modern. Okay. Let's talk just a little bit about these artists. And actually, let me pull up well, I might not be able to, so, okay. We'll just talk about the artists that are present. And the prior story, I'm not sure if that was Bernie Krigstein. It didn't look like his style, but it may have been. Really not positive. Guess I should have kept the listing so I could be certain. Be easy enough to look up, but I can't really access my keyboard here. So, and anyway, let's talk a little bit about okay, first of all, Joe Orlando. So Joe Orlando in the early 1950s was an assistant to Wally Wood. Is that right? Let's see, is that the Orlando piece? Yeah, I assume so. Unless... Okay. And he was earning $25 a page at EC shortly after his first EC story started under his own name. They were published that summer. And this is from an interview with John B. Cook from The Comic Book Artist. Did you seek out Neil Adams for covers? Now, Joe Orlando went on to be the art director or the art editor at DC Comics, where he worked very closely with his friend Carmine Infantino, who famously did not get along very well with Gil Kane. Gil Kane talks about that very extensively, that he and Carmine were rivals, and for whatever reason, they just really clashed. But according to Joe Orlando, he got along famously well with Carmine, so they worked very closely together at DC, and Joe was the art director when he sort of brought in Neil Adams for covers. And so this was an interesting little bit that I took from the Comic Book Artist interview. Did you seek out Neil Adams for the covers, is a question from John B. Cook. Yes, I sought Neil. Bill Gaines, who was, of course, famously the publisher of EC Comics, told me a long time ago that the best-selling covers he had published were ones that depicted boys in danger. He got the idea from an illustration in Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, where Tom was in a graveyard and witness to a murder. That concept in many ways worked over and over again. Neil did his best covers for House of Mystery. A lot of people would argue that. Those House of Mystery comics are now extremely valuable, but obviously people really love his work on Detective Comics, and obviously Dead Man is another one. Many times he'd walk in with a sketch that he had thought up himself, and I would often get a story written for the sketch. Now that's an interesting tidbit. And it was a fun way to work and to have that kind of rapport with the artists, the writers, and the creative director. And then he asked, did you guys collaborate on covers? And Joe Orlando says, it depended. Sometimes I would come in with an idea, and other times the artist would. Once we were working together, I couldn't tell you who did what. Some covers I remember, like the one with the boy under the bed, with the water around, was all Neil. The guy running around who looks like half man, half bat was all Bernie Wrightson. I guess that would be Man-Bat. Very famous. Neil Adams went on to do some Man-Bat covers as well, but Bernie Wrightson, and actually Frank Robbins created Man-Bat, I do believe. At this point, it was a bunch of guys who understood each other, and I was just a point man, so they would just be receptive, and my sales were good, so I could go to Carmine and get almost anything by that, get almost anything done, I suppose. Because it was that good. Of course, he was working with Bernie Wrightson, Neil Adams, and Gil Kane was actually working for him at the time. And Joe Orlando, as you see, was a great artist himself. Beautiful work here. Incredibly overlooked. I mean, I would say I like Joe Orlando's stuff just as much as Wally Wood's in a lot of ways. And yet, people don't talk about Orlando as much or with the same kind of reverence. And sadly, he stopped drawing mostly when he became an art director. He's a guy who's just trying to make a living, but and this is so much work, so hard to illustrate comics, so it must have been a lot better to have somebody else illustrate them and just be able to sort of be the arbiter of taste and choosing the artist. But still kind of a sad loss, because he was a really extraordinarily good artist. And let's see, I thought I had some biographical work on a little bit of information on him, but I guess I didn't get a good piece. But I know Joe Orlando was born in Italy, and I think he moved to the United States when he was about 2 years old. So basically, he was born in Italy, grew up in the United States, became an artist for EC when he was around 23. All of these guys were in their very early 20s. As you can see, Howell Williamson was very young too. And that's all the more extraordinary, because these guys were such fully formed artists by the time they reached EC and were working in their 20s. Frank Frazetta was a teenager. And it's just extraordinary that they were that accomplished. Most artists these days do not develop that fast, but they were largely devoid of television and largely devoid, obviously, of computers and of the internet and all of these incredible distractions. So much of what they did was reading and drawing constantly, more so than even some of the hardest working writers and artists today. So that may be the only explanation I have for it, aside from also being exposed to a lot of classical artists as opposed to just looking at other comics artists to get their inspiration. So that's another thing. Certainly Frank Frazetta was very well versed in fine arts as well. So a little bit about Wally Wood, because Wally Wood had one of the most interesting stories at EC as well. And this is basically straight from Wikipedia, but it's all pretty credible. It's all credible, I should say. In addition to Wood's hundreds of comic book pages, he illustrated for books, magazines, while also working in a variety of other areas: advertising, packaging, product illustrations, gag cartoons, record album covers. So he was actually incredibly prolific. Syndicated comic strips, trading cards, including Topps landmark Mars Attack set. Most of that stuff was for money. I really wish he had just been able to draw a lot more comics. EC publisher William Gaines once stated, "Wally may have been our most troubled artist, and I'm not suggesting any connection, but he also may have been our most brilliant," which is incredibly high praise when you have a bullpen that features not only Wally Wood, but Al Williamson, Frank Frazetta, Roy Krenkel, Reed Crandall. The list just goes on and on and on. So Wally was born in Monaga, Minnesota, began reading and drawing comics at an early age. He was strongly influenced by the art styles of Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon, which also was a big influence on Frazetta and a big influence on Al Williamson in particular. Milton Caniff's Terry and the Pirates, another big influence on so many artists. And Hal Foster's Prince Valiant, which, if you ever have a chance to see, look up online some of the original art from Hal Foster's Prince Valiant when it was in its prime, when he was in his prime. It's just absolutely beautiful. Way too good to belong as a newspaper strip, considering just kind of the disposability of newspaper. Even though both are on newsprint, which is the same as comics. Will Eisner's The Spirit, and especially Roy Crane's Wash Tubs. Roy Crane is sort of forgotten these days, but another sort of very kind of old style classic artist that influenced a lot of these guys. Recalling his childhood, Wood would say that his dream at age 6 was to find a magic pencil that could draw anything, and that foretold his future as an artist, which is a really kind of magical and beautiful story that unfortunately takes a really dark twist as his life, in the latter part of his life. So Wally Wood was married 3 times. His first marriage was the most famous in terms of comics terms because he was married to Tatiana Wood, who later did extensive work in comic books as a colorist, and which is kind of similar to Frank Miller, who was, I do believe, married to Lynn Varley, who colored so much of his work, was a real collaborator with Frank Miller. And Tatiana Wood was a major colorist at DC, particularly, and maybe Marvel as well, for a long time. Their marriage ended in the late 1960s, and his second marriage was to Marilyn Silver, which also ended in divorce. But here's the sort of capper, in the sense, for much of his adult life, Wood suffered from chronic, unexplainable headaches, and in the 1970s, following bouts of alcoholism, Wood suffered kidney failure. A stroke in 1978 caused the loss of vision in one eye, which you can imagine is absolutely devastating for an artist, aside from the stroke itself, which a lot of times debilitates your motor functions anyway. Faced with declining health, career prospects, he committed suicide by gunshot in Los Angeles 3 years later, 3 years after being struck by the stroke. So that would be 1981. Toward the end of his life, an embittered Wood said, according to one biography, if I had to do it all over again, I would have cut my hands off. And never been an artist. He would have had a happier life. At least that's the way he felt at the end of his life, which is absolutely tragic. In 1972, EC editor Harvey Kurtzman, who worked very closely with Wood during the 1950s, said Wally had a tension in him, an intensity that he locked away in an internal steam boiler. I think it ate away his insides, and the work really used him up. I think he delivered some of the finest work that was ever drawn, and I think it's to his credit that he put so much intensity into his work at great sacrifice to himself, which is really tragic. So, that's a little background on Wally Wood, Joe Orlando, Howell Williamson, and these are the final pages of this Joe Orlando story. You see some of the monsters that were almost kind of crocodilian monsters that were on the cover. Didn't really expect that correlation between the cover and an actual story, and both drawn by Joe Orlando, of course. And the final page, advertisements that were pretty commonplace, don't look any out of place even by like Silver Age Marvel standards, the classic sort of 98-pound weakling things that were so popular back then too. Back cover is mystery novels, 7 mystery novels, all yours for $1, including I Killed That Cop. And so there you have it. Once again, Weird Fantasy number 19, and 10 cents. You can tell me whether it looks like a $60 comic or not. That is a 2.0, I would say, but a 2.0 with a really nice cover. They did not mention that it was a detached cover, which it basically is. They did mention that it had a 2.5-inch spine split, which it does, but it's very difficult to tell how bad these staples were in the lone image, but I'm actually perfectly fine with this condition and with this cover. It still looks really good, especially for a 2.0. I think it actually might be a little bit better. It has a lot of spine stress, but even with that spine stress, it would probably be a lot better, even with the spine split, if the cover wasn't so detached. So, second comic I bought on an impulse is one I've looked at online, I've thought about many times, and I really wanted to get the Marvel Super Special that collects them both, and I also would like to just get the 3 comics. I just bought this one. This is, for the time being, this costs $4.20. I think it's absolutely worth it. It's Dune number 1. Of course, the adaptation of the David Lynch version of Dune, which was critically lambasted, and the critics were absolutely full of shit. Absolutely brilliant, brilliant movie that you just have to see multiple times, sometimes to even understand everything that's in it, but you never stop seeing something new in that movie, and that movie is amazing. Actually does have a lot of tie-ins. We talk about how much Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon was so influential on these young AC artists. The Flash Gordon TV serial from around this time period, I think maybe preceding, maybe in the 40s. Really kind of cheesy, bad special effects, but somehow strangely effective. And David Lynch actually tried to incorporate some modern special effects with that same sort of feel of the Flash Gordon serial. A lot of people just did not get it. But this comic is illustrated by Bill Sienkiewicz, and I mean, Bill Sienkiewicz doing Dune, fantastic. And in fact, I saw an image of Bill Sienkiewicz on Facebook just yesterday. He had taken a picture with the cast of New Mutants, of course, one of the most famous books that he ever illustrated. I guess I'm not even familiar. I guess there's a Netflix show coming out with that, or maybe there's a movie, I'm not sure, but he took a photo with them. He looks as cool as they all do, and a friend of mine, I commented on the photo, and then a friend of mine saw it and commented how much he loved this Dune comic, and I said, well, that's really strangely ironic because I just ordered it and it just arrived yesterday. So this is Bill Sienkiewicz, and I think that's Virginia Madsen, of course, and the likenesses of, I think there's some pretty abstract stuff in here from what I've seen online, but the likenesses of the actual characters are pretty spot on, really brilliant. This, I think it's Miguel Ferrer, I'm pretty sure. I forget the names of these actors, many of these actors these days, but I've seen this Dune film multiple times. Kyle MacLachlan, of course, and should instantly recognize him. Captain Picard. And I was under the impression that this was a lot more abstract and sort of the Sienkiewicz sort of style, but it actually is very straightforward. Really beautiful portraits of, you know, spot-on portraits of the cast. And Bill Sienkiewicz told a story. Fantastic, the Baron Harkonnen. Fantastic beast. Great villain. But Bill Sienkiewicz told a story in which he was at a party, and I forgot what this TV show was, but Alia, he recognized this girl. She seemed so familiar to him. He had met her at the party and was speaking to her, and then it finally came to him that she played Alia in Dune, and he had to tell her that he had illustrated her as a little girl. And he said it was a little bit weird trying to explain that I drew you as a little girl, but she had no familiarity whatsoever with the comic, and so he promised to get her a version of the comic. But it's pretty cool that he would meet her as an adult many years later. She's still in television, and she was a very eerie and also crucial presence as Paul's younger sister. Sting, one of the easier portraits, but Sienkiewicz did go a little bit impressionistic with that one. Kind of odd seeing, you know, this work feels pretty weighty, and then you see like ads for Power Pack and the Amazing Spider-Man. It's okay. It's so weighty, it's science fiction. And final page just gives Sienkiewicz a chance to sort of get into his abstractions with a giant sandworm. And fantastic final page. Unfortunately opposite of this ridiculous G.I. Joe ad, except for the fact that this has a wraparound cover painting by Michael Golden, so it's another great artist of the time period. And that is it for Dune number 1. That is it for Weird Science Fantasy number 19, and that is it for an unboxing of 2 comics that actually I spent an hour talking about. So that may explain why no one's listening. But anyway, once again, thanks for listening whoever's out there, and hope you enjoyed this sort of in-depth look into a single issue of EC Comics. There may be some more in the future, who knows. I can't really afford to be too extravagant in my purchases of 2.0 comics from the 1950s, and but there'll certainly be more unboxings in the future and plenty of more content coming up. Lots of good stuff. So thanks for listening, and by all means, like, comment, any comments, and subscribe. Thank you. Goodbye.